Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to the very first Global Deal High-Level Forum on Social Dialogue. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and what an absolute privilege it is to moderate this critically important conversation. As some of you might know, we are in our second of 4 sessions this week. We are having conversations anchored around the broad theme of looking at a labor market beyond the pandemic and looking at how social dialogue can shape this new labor market. Now, yesterday we had a really good conversation that was really looking at the role of social dialogue in strong and inclusive jobs recovery. Some of the sound bites that came out that were absolutely excellent yesterday, we heard how social dialogue gives us both the opportunity and the responsibility to create a labor market that is jobs rich, that is gender sensitive, and that delivers on decent work. We also heard yesterday about the importance of structural policy reforms that really can deliver on the labor market that we're looking for, and also the importance of recognizing collective bargaining as one of the many tools in which we can create the space where we can have the dialogues that allow us to reset the blueprint of the labor market. And so we're building on some of those themes today, as today we turn our focus to social dialogue and global supply chains. And of course, we're keeping in mind the context of international trade. Now, one of the key things that came out yesterday, and I do not doubt is going to be consistent over the 4 sessions this week, is that we really are seeing how COVID-19 has truly demonstrated the need for social dialogue, not only to address the issues and the challenges that we are facing today, but certainly to give us the capability and the tools to be able to address the challenges of tomorrow that our societies continue and will likely be grappling with. Our format is going to remain the same. Just like yesterday, we're going to kick off with some opening remarks. We're going to then make our way into a scene setter, some scene setting remarks, and we're going to take and mine everything that we get out of those opening remarks and out of the scene setter, and we're going to pull that into a robust panel discussion. So my panelists are standing by, and I will introduce them when we get to the panel. One of the other invitations that we extended yesterday, and we continue to extend today, is for you to send us your questions and your comments during the panel. We really want to integrate your voice into this conversation and really pull in your experiences and your thoughts as this conversation unfolds. I know that some of us are going to be following on social media platforms across the board. We are using 2 particular hashtags, hashtag Global Deal Forum and hashtag Social Dialogue. And so let's amplify this conversation and really take it to the world so that they might know some of the insights that are coming out of the conversation today. Ladies and gentlemen, if there's one thing I can underscore, is that your voice in this forum is important. It is your contribution to the global deal, and it is that contribution that has the ability to make a difference. So it's been an absolute pleasure that the partners could come together, global deal partners could come together. So we've got governments, we've got business, we've got trade unions, really coming in and leaning into this conversation anchored in social dialogue. Now, as we get started today, allow me to transition us to our opening speaker. It's always such a pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Guy Ryder. He is, of course, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, first elected in 2012 and re-elected in 2017. And suffice to say that his vision is for an ILO that anticipates and responds effectively to the realities of the world of work in the 21st century, reaching the most vulnerable, and of course, staying true to its social justice mandate. And so with that, Mr. Ryder, let me give you the floor so that you might extend your opening remarks to all of us.
Well, thanks very much, Nosy, and my greetings to all the fellow panelists, ministers, and others. Nosy, you said that we've tried to make the ILO better at anticipating events. I'm not quite sure how well we did when it came to the pandemic. We didn't see it coming. But what we've done subsequently is to document what the pandemic has been doing to the world of work. And you've asked me to talk about perhaps 3 different aspects of that. One is about inequality, about supply chains, and the role of social dialogue, which is what we're here to discuss really centrally. And let me just sort of give the fundamentals of what's happened to the world of work over the last 18 months or so. And I think The first thing to register is the magnitude of what has happened. We estimate in its entirety that the damage to the world of work has been 4 times as severe as what happened in 2008, 2009 during the financial crisis. So this is an unprecedented situation in quantitative terms, in terms of employment, labor income, enterprise mortality. So let's have that very, very clear. And within those, that really very extreme social and economic cost, we know, I think it's undisputed, that it is the weakest, the most vulnerable in labor markets that have been hit the hardest. So women, young people, migrants, informal workers, small and medium-sized enterprises as opposed to others. And that inevitably means that this pandemic has not only revealed, brought to the surface, if you like, the pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, it's added to them, it's made them worse. And I think this has been, if it's had any salutary effect, it's to make us look once again at issues, and I'm sure my friend Jose Antonio will come to this, of social protection and the lacunae in social protection systems and a great deal else. What I find particularly concerning today, speaking at this stage of the pandemic, and we're awaiting the figures coming out from the IMF for the economic forecast for the coming year or so, is that we seem to be on a trajectory of recovery, and I use the word with some caution, which the Secretary General of the United Nations has described as a great divergence. That is to say, the richer nations, those nations which have access to fiscal space and have access to vaccines, are bouncing back and will bounce back more quickly than those countries that do not, largely those in the developing and emerging world. And this great divergence, I think, runs the risk of adding a whole new quality to the issues of inequality in the world. And we really have to correct this great divergence. So inequality should be at the center of our discussions. Some better news is about social dialogue, because we have documented in the last 18 months the extent to which our member states have had recourse to social dialogue to handle the impact of the pandemic. What have we found? We found that over 100 of our member states have used social dialogue in very clearly identifiable ways for very specific outcomes. And we divide those outcomes between emergency outcomes, so getting together to talk about how to deal with the immediate impact of the crisis, then adjustment outcomes, how to move to live with the pandemic when it's been at its worst, and now perhaps most relevant, recovery outcomes, how to work together to plan the way forward. So the message from this is, even in, and perhaps especially in, these rather dire circumstances, when governments, employers and workers' organizations have sat down together, it's really helped us through. No, this is not social dialogue as an ideology. This is social dialogue as a problem solver to produce practical way forwards from difficult situations. And lastly, I'll come to global supply chains, because I think you're going to be focusing on those as well, Nosy, I'll finish with this. You know, debates around global supply chains did not begin with the pandemic. They will not end with the pandemic. But I think the pandemic, again, rather like inequality, has brought our focus very much to bear once more on global supply chains. I think people are stressing today because they see what happens when global supply chains are threatened, break down, or are blocked. And there's plenty of examples, be it semiconductors, be it foodstuffs, be it in energy, of the consequences of the breakdown of global supply chains. And I'm sure colleagues will have greater insight than me in that regard. So we know that global supply chains are of the most fundamental importance to the global economy. And this is what's happening at the ILO, requires us to look back also at the way we organize global supply chains, the debates about the social management of global supply chains. As I say, not new. In the ILO, we're moving to a new stage of a debate, which has sometimes been frustrating. Let me be honest, we've sometimes got into an impasse about mandated due diligence around human rights, with some of our constituents strongly in favor, others strongly against. We hope by March of next year to have a report of a working group that will put the building blocks of a strategic approach on global supply chains before us to help us move forward in these important debates. Let me hand it back to you there, Nosy, and of course, I really look forward to the debate that's going to follow.
Mr. Guy, thank you very much. It's an excellent opening remark that we're certainly going to be building on. We've heard you talking about the courage to put inequality at the center of our conversations this week. We've heard you talking about how social dialogue is not an ideology, but it is a tool to really problem solve in complex situations. And that also, as you look at global supply chains, one of the advances in the conversation has been pulling into focus due diligence along those supply chains. And you'll be pleased to know, DG, that is the focus of the conversation tomorrow. So we're certainly going to be building very much on what you've shared with us. It's my pleasure now, ladies and gentlemen, to transition us to some scene-setting remarks that will come from Professor Jose Antonio Ocampo. He is the Director of the Economic and Political Development Concentration in the School of International and Political Affairs at Columbia University. He has occupied numerous positions at the United Nations and in Colombia, including UN Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, the Executive Secretary of the UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, including Minister of Finance, Minister of Agriculture. I could spend the rest of the afternoon from here in Johannesburg speaking to his leadership. It's an absolute privilege that he is with us today. And before I hand over to Professor, just a quick reminder, ladies and gentlemen, that you can follow in French, English, or Spanish this conversation. Professor, the floor is yours as we lean into your scene-setting remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Notsi, and thank you to the Global Deal for this invitation. I have actually had the pleasure of participating in the Global Deal since the beginning. So it's a great pleasure to be back, hopefully in person very, very soon again. And let me perhaps start by underscore. Well, thank you to welcome the opportunity to see a good writer who has been a good friend for a long time, and of course all the panelists, including two Colombians, also on the panel. Let me start by underscoring two things. I mean, one that I have emphasized since the beginning of the Global Deal, which is the issue of informal employment and let's say, and particularly independent workers, which is a very, very important issue in labor, in the labor markets, let's say, and which is very important because of the standards for them are generally lower. So they really belong to the sometimes to the worst a group of informal workers in the labor force. And the second point which I made in a preparatory meeting to this panel is that beyond global value chains, I think it's interesting to talk about international trade and the relation between international trade and employment. Global value chains are, of course, the most dynamic element in international trade. But let me say that there is also the growing world of service, international services, which of course has boomed during the pandemic and which has implications that have to be analyzed in the post-pandemic world. And the other, of course, the more traditional, which is the issue of commodity producers, and particularly of a small scale commodity producers, which is a very important issue in many developing countries in relation to agricultural production. Let me say in my country, I mean the tradition of coffee, but you can say cocoa and many other products really come from small producers, and I think that's a very important point. Now, having said that, let me say that during the crisis, of course, there was a global disruption of global value chains that a good writer already pointed out in his initial remarks, and overcoming those is very important because of the employment effect they have in many countries. and of course, both direct and also indirect, because in some cases you don't have the inputs for production, which is an important part, let's say, of the disruption in international trade. Let me again point out that the service sector has been improving, of course, the virtual services, because other services like tourism has been significantly affected by the pandemic. And there is also let's say, for commodity producers, actually good news, because the recovery of commodity prices started in the middle of last year, and now it has continued this year, so that for many producers it's good news. Of course, if they can sell their products and ship them, which is one of the issues that associated to the disruption of international trade that has not been fully recovered. There might be also a redefinition of supply chains, which is a point that has been pointed out, and particularly whether they will be relocated from East Asia to other parts of the world is a good question. Of course, let's say, for example, the disruptions in Vietnam, which is now one of the major, most important countries in the value chain, is an important issue. Now, having said that, let me say what is the room for social dialogue, which is the essence, of course, of the global deal, and of course, at the center of all the history of the International Labour Organization. And let me point out, perhaps, that beyond decent work, and this is from my UN days, and it's captured actually in SDG 8, which is full and productive employment and decent work for all. By the way, this terminology comes from a 2005 General Assembly resolution that we were able to pass at that time with Mr. Juan Somavia, then Director General of ILO, because of the surprising shock that we had, that in the MDGs the word employment was not mentioned at all. And we were able in 2005 to introduce the word employment. We wanted to have actually another MDG, but they didn't accept it as another MDG. But fortunately now it's only a target in MDG 1, but now it's of course in SDG 8. And let me say that what does that mean? That means first of all, income. Some income that is adequate for for the standards of living in different countries. Of course, this means that different wage levels and incomes in different countries according to the level of development. But that is also an opportunity for the lower income countries to improve living standards, which is something that we have seen in the most successful cases of let's say, of export development in several countries. But it's also, and very importantly, the issue of access to social protection. And that means access to health, to the health systems, access to pension systems, which is even worse in terms of coverage than health in most countries. And is given the terminology of the SDGs, is also some time of labor stability, so that there are some rules. I mean, this of course for wage employment in particular, but there are long rules in more than a century of ILO on that particular point, which must be taken into account. So this is a very fruitful issue for social dialogue. It should be at the center, of course, with ministers of labor, but also at the highest level, even the presidents and prime ministers being on top of the agenda. And let me emphasize again that aside from wage labor, independent workers must be in the agenda. This is more difficult because at least labor unions represent wage laborers, sometimes not the lower income wage laborers, by the way, but they should increase their coverage to include them. But independent workers don't have a similar thing. So that's a big responsibility of governments to organize a dialogue with independent producers, be in the rural sector, but also in the urban sector, where they are of course very important because overcoming informality, again my obsession in the global deal through time, it requires the inclusion of the Russian informality requires the inclusion of independent workers in rural and urban sectors of the economy. And finally, let me also point out, echoing a good writer, that this is a short-term but also a very long-term issue. I mean, there is a short-term issue of how to use the opportunities of the recovery to improve the standards of living and the quality of labor of those workers in value chains and in commodity production, let's say, and in service production today. But it's even more a long-term issue because the major issues associated to global value chains and to the small producers of commodities is a very long-term issue which has been in the agenda for a long time. And I think national dialogue is important, but also international dialogue. And I think the ILO should be at the center, of course, of the international dialogue about how to improve, again, full and productive employment and decent work for all. Thank you very much.
Professor Ocampo, thank you very much. There are lots of nods across the board as you're speaking, and I certainly take that as an indication of really hearing the invitation that you've given to us. And so if I pull together the threads from what we've heard from Mr. Ryder and Professor Ocampo, it's really set the stage for the conversation we need to have. We've heard Professor Ocampo saying, don't make the mistake of leaving out informal workers, wage workers, independent workers in this conversation. I've heard him also reiterating a point that Mr. Guy Ryder spoke about. Mr. Ryder said to us, let's look at 3 horizons: immediate impact, adjustment, and recovery. And Professor Ocampo says, absolutely, we need to look at both the short-term, but also the medium to long-term implications. As we now get into this conversation, we really want to really ask the question, how does social dialogue allow us and enable us, one, to advance decent work in supply chains, to overcome informality, as Professor Ocampo has indicated, to deal and engage with the challenges of informal work, and most importantly, of course, to build resilience for future crises that we know are going to be on their way. And so maybe with that, allow me to quickly introduce my panelists, ladies and gentlemen. And as I do, allow me to also remind you, your voice matters, your contribution matters. Send us your questions and your comments as this panel discussion unfolds. Allow me to introduce the Minister of Employment and Labor in South Africa. That's Minister Thulas Nxesi. He has served South Africa and the continent in many roles, including chairman of the South African Communist Party. His previous parliamentary roles have included the Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform, Minister of Sports and Recreation, and Minister of Public Works. So welcome to Minister Nxesi. Professor Ocampo, this is not recognizing another South African. I saw you recognizing the other panelists from Colombia in the conversation. Allow me also then, of course, to recognize the Vice Minister of Employment and Pensions in the Ministry of Labor in Colombia. So that is, of course, Minister Andres Felipe Uribe Medina. He is with us. Thank you very much, Vice Minister. He has served in a number of capacities, including as Director of the General Directorate of Economic Regulation of Social Security in the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit. Moving on, I'd like to introduce Madame Leila Etter. Leila is the Global Head of Sustainability at the H&M Group. She, amongst many other things, is responsible for driving and implementing sustainability throughout the group. Leila, it's such a pleasure to have you joining us here today. We're also joined by Madame Gabriela Boucher. She is, of course, the Executive Director of Oxfam International. And to just give you a paraphrase, Ms. Boucher is an experienced social justice leader that is deeply committed to gender equality and to human rights and tackling economic inequality. So we're really glad to have her voice and insights in this conversation. We're also joined by Mr. Atle Huye. So that was me really practicing his surname the whole day today. But Mr. Huye, of course, is the General Secretary of Industrial All Global Union. He was previously International Secretary of Fellesforbundet, the Norwegian United Federation of Trade Unions. So we look forward, Atle, to hearing from you today. And we also have joining us Madame Paola Simonetti. She is the Director of the Equality Department, and this at the International Trade Union Confederation. And in this position, she leads actions in key areas such as economic integration of women, fighting gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, which was a huge theme yesterday, and organizing against discrimination and exclusion of marginalized workers, which I'm certain is really complementary to some of the insights that we've heard already in the conversation. So maybe let me start off here. Let me go to Minister Nxesi first. Minister, one of the key things we've heard Professor Ocampo talking about has been about informal workers. And we know that informal workers have been affected disproportionately by the crisis. The question that I'd like to bring to you, Minister, is what is the role, in your view, of social dialogue and contributions that employer organizations and trade unions can make to develop sustainable social protection mechanisms for all? What is the role of social dialogue? To you, Minister Nxesi.
Thank you, Nosi, and good afternoon to all the panelists and the colleagues. I can confirm, Nosi, that in South Africa, the poor and the most vulnerable workers have been affected disproportionately by the COVID-19 crisis. And statistics in South Africa have indicated that informal workers were more likely to lose their jobs, and informal businesses were more likely to have closed down due to the lockdowns associated with the curbing or with curbing the spread of the virus. And again, in South Africa, we also only have limited social protection outside, of the formal sector. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the social partners, organized business, labor, government, and community came together under the banner of the National Economic Development and Labor Council, we call it NEDLAC, to respond proactively and speedily to the pandemic and its impact. And one of their key areas of focus was an income replacement for the workers and increased income support for the unemployed. And through the engagement at NEDLAC, new grants were developed and speedily implemented primarily by the Department of Employment and Labor and the Department of Social Development. And firstly, Unemployment Insurance Fund, a contributory fund from the employers and the employees, developed what was called the COVID-19 Temporary Employee Relief Scheme. We called it TERS, which provided income support on a sliding scale linked to the current wages to all the workers who were unable to work due to the lockdown. Initially, employers applied for the benefit and were meant to pass it over to the employees. But over time, we realized that it was preferable to pay employees directly. So this fund, UIF, has contributed almost 62 billion South African rand to income support for the workers and making enormous difference to the workers' livelihoods and staving off the closure of the many businesses. There was also an envelope for workers who had comorbidities or were over 60 before vaccines were available and could not safely return to the work, and workers who had to isolate or even quarantine as a result of the exposure to COVID. In the beginning, we made this grant available to workers who were not contributors to the UIF fund, and this did help more vulnerable workers. And I want to urge again, even workers in other countries, I mean the employers, the issue of this insurance is very important for the employers during these bad times. So we had to deal with employers who were not making their contributions, but some of them were even deducting the money from the workers, but did not hand it over to the fund. And we had hoped now to recruit their employers to become contributors. However, the fund could not assist, and this is very interesting, could not assist atypical workers, such as contractors, musicians, and others in the entertainment sector, and the e-hailing drivers, as they are not covered in the definition of the employee. This is an issue which the social partners have committed to start addressing going forward. And South Africa has a very extensive social grant system, including the elderly and for the child support. However, we were forced to introduce a 350 special fund, but now there's a big debate, and we kept on extending it as the pandemic continued, but there's a big debate now about how do you ensure that you have a social grant. It's a big debate, and I think next year there will be a big, what we call a debate in relation to this matter, trying to finalize it.
Minister Nxesi, thank you very much for that response. I think just to lift up a couple of the things. One, you spoke to us about NEDLAC, which clearly sounds like this is the platform that enables social dialogue amongst the social partners. So a clear linkage around how NEDLAC enables, through social dialogue, some of the responses that you spoke about that South Africa was able to respond with. Again, the authenticity of raising some of those challenges, like the atypical workers that don't fit neatly into the way we've defined what constitutes a worker. And that's an opportunity, of course, for us to begin to think, how do we reset the blueprint? How do we reimagine some of those definitions? And maybe just the last thing, Minister says, you talk about a big debate. This is really important because the debate then is almost the metaphor for an opportunity for dialogue. And what I'm hearing is that there is dialogue happening in the South African context. And of course, it's something that we'll follow closely. So let me move from South Africa. Let me go to Colombia next, and to the Vice Minister. And Vice Minister, I really want to bring the issue of disrupted global supply chains into the conversation, because we know that some of the worst impacts were on the most vulnerable workers. We're talking about workers that were employed in lower tiers of the supply chain, often informal, often migrant workers, very much limited social protection access, very limited in terms of income support to them. The question to you, Vice Minister, is how did the pandemic affect Colombia's labor market, and what was the contribution of social dialogue to protect and to support workers and enterprises, particularly those that were integrated into global supply chains? Vice Minister, over to you.
Thank you, Nozi. Thank the Global Deal for this invitation. Good morning, good afternoon to all my fellow panelists, Professor Ocampo and Mr. Ryder, and all the panelists. Well, the impact on the labor market at its most critical point during the pandemic, we lost about 5.4 million jobs out of a labor force of just over 20 million people. So it was obviously a very big impact on our labor force. And of course, the informal workers were hit the hardest. Even though there was also an impact, of course, on the formal work market, informal work has been much more volatile throughout the pandemic, both in the very beginning when we lost a lot of jobs, most of them were informal, and in the recovery, the recovery has been higher on informal jobs. I mean, our structural informality persists, of course, throughout the pandemic. We have been recovering these jobs, as I was telling you. By last August, we had recovered about 5 million of those jobs we lost during the pandemic. And since the very beginning, we promoted from the Ministry of Labor, we promoted the social dialogue, especially the direct dialogue between workers and employees. The Ministry of Labor presented the alternatives they all had to avoid layouts. We promoted alternatives legally available, actually alternatives very simple, like sending people on vacation or paid leaves. And we did see a significant increase in workers going on vacation early. We can track these figures throughout our social security figures, and we did see a large increase in people going on vacation. We also promoted a dialogue between workers and employers for them to agree on flexible schedules to avoid agglomerations on public places and to allow for more people to be able to go to work. We always emphasized the point that the worker has to agree on whichever mechanism the employer wanted to apply on their business. Of course, we also generated a lot of safety net measures. We created a basic income for those most vulnerable, precisely that informal labor force, which was hit so hard. We created a basic income for them, and millions of informal workers who lost their job are still getting a basic income we created during the pandemic. We also activated an unemployment benefit for formal workers as well. We benefited about 200,000 workers with this benefit. And of course, there is the subsidy for employers who have kept their workers throughout the pandemic. We have protected over 4 million jobs with this mechanism, and we're still here in social emergency. So all these benefits created in a state of emergency are going to keep being applied in the future. So social dialogue has been very important because everybody has come together, at least in the very basic needs that our labor market has today, and to promote employment and to ask employers to keep the very basic figures of employment that they have before the pandemic. So in the very basic level, we have achieved a very interesting social agreement.
Vice Minister, thank you very much. As you speak about the response and how it came from social dialogue, what I'm also hearing you saying is recognizing now the opportunity to act beyond the emergency. One of the things that Mr. Jared Bernstein spoke about yesterday was using the interesting analogy that what the world is going through is very similar to what happens when the tide comes in, and we're exposed and we see who's really swimming naked, were some of the words that he used. And now that we know what the exposed vulnerabilities are, what we're hearing in conversation is the opportunity to really build back better because we have a greater understanding of those vulnerabilities. And so with that, Leila, I'd like to come to you next with the next question. And I really want us to zoom in on the International Accord for Health and Safety. We know that H&M is among the first signatories of this accord in the garment and textile industry. We know that this is now a legally binding agreement that is intended to protect workers in the Bangladeshi ready-made garment industry. So a couple of questions, Leila. First, what are the key features of this agreement? How will the agreement promote health and safety of ready-made garment workers, whilst at the same time reinforcing existing social dialogue structures at the enterprise, at the sectoral, and at the country level? It's a loaded question, but I'm sure that you're going to unpack it for us.
First of all, thank you, Nozi, and thanks for Global Deal arranging this great forum. Thanks for all our associate partners in this platform. I will start with, I'll take questions one by one. How will the agreement promote health and safety and new setup? Actually, what we are talking with the Ready-Made Garments Sustainability Council called RSC is continued commitment to prioritize health and safety, but implementing with the national stakeholders. So it's been strongly supported by these brands, international players, but the important part is it's a national agreement. This is important because RSC has been strongly supported in the new agreement that we have been building in here. It's been done with consultation with the Bangladeshi government, and this is for me where the power is coming from, because it's not with the international body, it's with the national Bangladeshi body, and then this is the only way we believe it's good for long-term change. The second part, how this is going to be promoted even further is, we hope that RSC to become a sector-wide program in Bangladesh. By expanding the work with RSC to entire industry, there's a huge potential to drive health and safety improvements for all workers in Bangladesh. Me, myself, I lived in Bangladesh for 3 years, drove the supply chain for H&M Group there. I know this is not an easy mission for any of us. And we can't reach this with one brand or with one partner. That's why it is super important that even though only now the factories work with the brands in the signatories and unions will participate, our vision is agreed on together with brands, unions, for RSC to have a big impact in medium term. Short term, even though we see now the similar impact, but for midterm, we really hope that it goes for industry-wide agreements. The last part, I would say that we would like to evaluate expanding collaboration, health and safety to other countries. This has been our ambition for some time. I mean, taking country learnings, we cannot copy-paste what we have done with Accord in Bangladesh. Accord has been a landmark process, I would say. It's been great success since 2013, and we believe that workers everywhere deserves a safe workplaces. So we are working together with all brands, trade union, employers to make this happen, following the consultations from our national stakeholders. Again, what's the difference from reinforcing existing social dialogue structure? Ready-Made Garment Sustainability Council itself is a tripartite structure. It's in the position of new accord signatures again, social dialogue between our partners, especially trade unions, employers, and this is our foundation to find solutions to improve conditions. Social dialogue and factory level has been our key focus since we started this journey. Working together with the management is the foundation of measuring success of the accord as well, and it's going to be success of measuring the local platform RSC. That's going to be the main key focus for us. Joint labor management from safety committees, which has been trained for many years now. Factory workers, which has been informed about their rights and what they could expect. Essentially, employee meetings, what we call IAMs, that we try to involve and inform them about their possible expectations and how this should be taken care. There's a compliant mechanism to ensure standards are met and issues are dealt with through RSC structures, where all brands have strong commitment to that. So from our side, Accord has been a landmark period. We need to bring Accord to local content to make sure that this is long-term national process that lead by Bangladeshi government, factories and unions with strong commitment from the brands. And we are hoping that our commitment towards health and safety remains same or getting increased with the time.
Leila, I think it's excellent. What I'm hearing you say is that social dialogue also creates the space for us to bring to the surface learnings and lessons from agreements that can now be scaled so that they become industry-wide, that can be extended to other countries. And of course, I'm also hearing you saying that we're not saying copy and paste as is, contextualize for the local environment, but we can scale. So maybe let me just stay a little bit with the Accord and go to you, Atle, in this conversation, because we know that industrial is also a key partner to the new international accord. The question to you, Atle, is what is your take on this renewed agreement, and which other key industry-wide initiatives based on social dialogue is industrial promoting?
Well, thanks, Nosy. First of all, let me agree with Leila that the Accord has been a groundbreaking agreement, groundbreaking process. But I want to take one step back, because any social dialogue cannot be valuable if you don't have partners that are on an equal footing. And that means that, first of all governments and all employers have to respect the right to organize, ILO Convention 87, and preferably, of course, ILO Convention 98 on the right to collective bargaining. This is now strategic parts of the new accord, which is very good for us, and which gives a better basis for a social dialogue. We are very happy that there is a continuation of the accord. It has been a tough process, and I have to be straight with you. It was against the will of the Bangladeshi government for some time. Even the Bangladeshi Supreme Court was against it. But we managed in the end, together with the brands and together with other good partners, to bring it to the result that Leila just explained. And this is extremely important because it gives our Bangladeshi affiliates a platform for social dialogue, which they never had. And this is something we need to expand to other branches, other areas of life. That takes me to the next question on other issues. We are also working on something called Action, Collaboration and Transformation in several countries in Asia, which is an initiative to get to sector-wide collective bargaining in the textile and clothing industry. Also an initiative which H&M is part of, where we're working with brands, with governments, with factory owners, to get to a stage where we actually can introduce sector-wide national collective bargaining, which is extremely important, I think, also for the brands to enable an environment where you can have equal level playing field for all in the country. We are, of course, also working through global framework agreements with a lot of the companies. Again, H&M is one of our good partners in this series of work. Also extremely important because if I take the example of H&M, we have national monitoring committees in different countries where the workers have a direct means of getting their case heard and getting their case solved in a way that brings them up to a level playing field with the other partners in this process. So these are some of the measures that we have to increase the social dialogue and the value of social dialogue. But back to basis, everybody has to respect the right to organize. If we don't do that, we can dream of everything else, but it doesn't really work.
Atle, you certainly are reinforcing a point that was also made yesterday, and it's increasingly becoming louder, and that's the importance, as you phrased it, of equal footing, going back to the basics and making sure that there is the right to collective bargaining is recognized. I also want to maybe just play back what I heard you say, that dialogue is not always easy. But from what I'm hearing from the partnership with H&M and other partners, might not be easy, but is always worth the effort in the end. And that's why we're able to talk about a groundbreaking accord and agreement. Gabriela, let me come to you next. I want to bring into focus now frontline workers and marginalized groups that I think in this conversation we've heard are paying the highest price and more likely are the ones to be pushed into poverty. We know that Oxfam International has always championed for inclusive and equitable responses to and the recovery from the crisis. The question to you, Gabriela, is what should governments, but also businesses and trade unions do to build more equal, more inclusive, and more sustainable economies where everyone has access to decent work?
Thanks, Nosy, and thanks to everyone at the Global Deal for bringing us all together at this intersection of decent work and equality. Now, every time I hear a policy or proposal, I ask, what does that mean for a woman called Chesa? And she's a frontline worker, as you're mentioning. She's 32 years old. She's a migrant in Southeast Asia who fillets fish that make their way to supermarket shelves across the world. So her income has been hit hard during the COVID-19 pandemic, and she had to move to a place she shared with 7 others. And when her children asked her for money, I quote her, she had to say, "I have nothing left to send them. I have to tell them to wait a bit more." And for those at the other end of the food chain, it's another story. So it would take Chesa nearly 6 millennia to earn what the CEO of a US top supermarket earns on average in a year. So this inequality is the story of the pandemic, as we have heard, in which business is booming for those at the top, with dividends for shareholders of listed supermarkets doubling during the pandemic, while people, especially women, throughout the supply chains are getting squeezed harder. So you asked me for actions for governments. First, we need to see a redistribution of income and power to workers and to small-scale producers, as was being mentioned by Professor Ocampo. That means protecting workers' rights and protections, not eroding them in the way that many governments are doing at the moment. So it means listening more to people in unions and obviously engaging in social dialogue, as has been said. It means also protecting land rights on the ground and ensuring producers of coffee, rice, or cocoa that feed global supply chains can really make a living of it, which is unfortunately not always the case. And it means ensuring mandatory due diligence on company supply chains. And we hold hope for legislation at the EU level here. Second, and talking more about the longer term, universal social protection has to be one of the legacies of this pandemic. So we want to see support for a global fund for social protection for low-income countries that would really make a difference to all these informal workers that we talked about that were not covered in many of the government interventions. Over a third of humanity has had no cash to cope with the pandemic's impacts. And we know the climate crisis makes this global fund even more urgent. So these are some of the key elements, I would say. Thank you.
Gabriela, thank you very much for bringing Tessa into the room and her lived experience. Mr. Guy Ryder, when he forwarded his opening remarks, he said, put inequality at the center of the conversation. And I think you've done exactly that. The actions from governments are loud and clear. The redistribution of power and income, recognition of land rights, the mandatory due diligence, which we're going to be speaking about this week. And one of the sound bites that certainly stands out for me, social protection as a legacy of this pandemic certainly stands out. Paula, let me come to you. And I really want us to maybe just pause on this idea of international labor standards, because we know that they provide workers and employers in the informal economy with the rights to organize and engage in social dialogue. However, and it's a big however, why are there so many challenges to exercise these rights in practice? And what can workers and trade unions do to overcome them?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, the story brought by Gabriela is the story that we are hearing almost on a daily basis from our affiliates all over the world. So we know that today we have a broken labor market with 60% of workers struggling to survive in the informal economy, literally. And more than a third of workers employed in the formal sector are in precarious and insecure work. And the majority of our emerging internet-mediated jobs, so the so-called platform business, are informal jobs. So the picture is not rosy at all. But we also know, as Director Guy Ryder said, that it was not new. I mean, the world entered the crisis already with a sustainability debt, if we can say so. So, and actually, when working on our ITUC SDG 8 Global Monitor, and I thank Professor Ocampo for mentioning the leading role on SDG 8 for recovery and resilience in that respect, we already see that there was, a lack of adequate wages and a lack of inclusive labor markets are still major questions that are hindering the well-being and the employment quality globally. We see that workers are still exposed to risk, under protection and exclusion on a global basis. If we think about, work-related illness and injury, it's a blunt example of that. But also that when wealthier countries seem to, perform better in respecting and implementing labor rights, as you were mentioning, Nosy, actually we see that the crisis had actually brought restriction on freedoms and labor rights and violation worldwide. So actually, unfortunately, we are hearing from our constituencies of cases where international labor standards violation are blunt in terms of non-compliance with labor regulation, or maybe putting up labor reforms or pension reforms that are actually restricting the right of workers instead of helping them in coping with the crisis, working hours and wage payment, and organizational health and safety regulation. So these are also, things that were not going well before, and the crisis have even made worse. So along with SDG 8, the ILO Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work, we think it's really the way forward, where, it was agreed that all workers, and this is again a reference to Professor Ocampo, all workers, so the universality should be guaranteed on their rights on occupational health and safety, minimum living wage, and minimum working hours. So this is, we call the new foundation of the new social contract that the trade unions are advocating strongly at all levels. So it's a transformative agenda for women and just transition for climate action and technological change. So, but if this is the polar star, we also think that ensuring decent work for informal workers especially is a matter of political will. In the end, is a matter of political will. And mandated due diligence for multinational enterprises and effective social dialogue are really at the heart of it. So unions are ready to engage with government, with employers in a social dialogue to ensure legislative guarantees, minimum living wages, and incomes, and comply with the international labor standards. I'll stop here, Nosy.
Paolo, thank you very much. A new foundation of the new social contract. Unions are ready, is what Paolo is reminding us. And again, it is a reflection of the readiness to engage in the conversation and readiness to engage with the issues. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have two very big things that we still need to do. We want to make sure that we're bringing in some of our questions from our audience. But before we get to our questions, I really want to do a quick whip around the room with the second question. Now, I think I'm going to exercise some of my moderator's superpowers at this point. And what that means is that I'm going to be super strict on the time and really asking you to be concise and to the point, no more than a minute in your responses now, so we can create the space to get our audience voice in. So Minister Nglesi, I'm going to come quickly to you. So I'm going to rework my way back into the conversation. And Minister Nglesi, what I'd like to bring into focus is the new social compact that President Ramaphosa has recently spoken about. The question to you is, what role can the new social compact between business, between labor, community, and government called for by the President of South Africa play in order to build a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable labor market? Minister, if I might ask you to kindly unmute.
Hello, you hear me? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And briefly, Nosy, in South Africa, the COVID-19 indeed deepened the economic crisis that we faced even prior to that. And the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, convened the government and social partners, and in his call for what we call a call to action for a comprehensive and a practical economic reconstruction and recovery plan to be developed and implemented with the agency that it required. And that has been done. And the key areas of focus of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan were the issue of the public infrastructure development, ensuring energy security, industrialization, and localization, the mass public employment programs, and the macroeconomic interventions and enablers of growth. The issue of green economy interventions, the agriculture and food security, and also reviving the tourism sector. So the social partners at NECLEC agreed on this social pact to drive the localization plan of about 200 billion over the next 5 years. And this has led to the identification of 42 products, 42 product areas across agro-processing, healthcare, basic consumer goods, capital goods, construction-driven value chains, and transport rolling stock as focus points for us. So CEO champions or chief executives from the private sector.
It appears that we might have
across the
Go ahead, Minister.
The cooperation between private and public sector is important to achieve these goals. Whilst government continue to work hard in developing industrial financing and incentives and supportive regulatory systems informed by the inputs from the social partners. Well, for maximum impact, there's a need for social partners to promote the local procurement of the South African manufacturing goods. So in short, the recovery plan, which has been agreed and negotiated at NECLEC, also focuses on support for the small and medium enterprises, fully aware that by 2030, no less than 90% of the new jobs will be created in the SMMEs. The demand-led skills development responding to the needs of the labor market and implementation of the broad-based black empowerment or economic empowerment, which provide opportunities for local entrepreneurs, which were previously excluded, so that we build the capacity and compete in a globalized economic environment. Thank you.
Minister Nxesi, thank you very much. And as we're listening into regulations, incentives with inputs from social partners, one of the things you spoke about was small and medium-sized enterprises, and maybe I want to latch onto that as I go to Vice Minister Medina again. Vice Minister, we know that the global call to action is for a human-centered recovery from the crisis. And we know that governments and social partners have agreed to accelerate the transition to the formal economy. The question to you, sir, is what can be done to fast track the promotion and the implementation of effective formalization strategies? More importantly, in your view, what is the role of social dialogue in that regard in 1 minute?
Well, as in any other country, informality manifests itself in low productivity and, of course, in very low income. So a structural cause for this low productivity comes from the way we are training our labor force. We are training them in skills that employers are not actually seeking. And this creates, obviously, a disconnect between labor and supply in the labor market. So we are addressing this through the new national qualification system. We created it in our development plan, and it's actually a very simple concept. Vocational training will now have an institutional setting that it lacks today in our country. Not only do we need to guarantee pertinent training, but we need to ensure quality, which today, in the case of vocational training in Colombia, is not even mandatory, and we're changing that. The creation of this qualification system has been open to social dialogue and participation in several settings of several actors of society. But furthermore, employers and worker unions will take part on the governance of this system, which highlights the importance we give to social dialogue in any national purpose as far as the labor market is concerned.
Vice Minister, I think it's such an excellent alignment with what we heard from Minister Nxesi. As you talk about vocational training and reimagining vocational training and really enabling it to be a conduit for relevant and quality skills. What I heard Minister Nxesi also talking about is ensuring that whether it is vocational training colleges or traditional institutions are churning out demand-led skills that are relevant for the labor market. And so maybe let me, Madame Boucher, Gabrielle, I want to come back to you, because one of the things that, as you brought Tessa into the conversation, is that you reminded us about the importance of really looking at gender discrimination. Now, we know that there's a recent analysis that's been done by Oxfam that looks at the systematic violation of workers' rights, exploitation and gender discrimination, which we know are widespread across the food supply chains, and we know this is true in many regions. The question that I'd really like to bring to you at this stage is, what actions should businesses take to empower women in supply chains and build more just and sustainable business models where the workers' right to organize and bargain collectively are not only respected, but they are also enabled?
Thanks, Inozi. Yes, and the starting point for us is to say that action to tackle inequality is both a human rights duty for business, but it's also better in the long term for business. I think the CEO of Unilever puts it very well when he says, without a healthy society, there cannot be healthy business. So through our work with supermarkets, we know change is possible. In the Netherlands, Albert Heijn, Jumbo, and Lidl recently committed to embed women's rights in its human rights policy and due diligence process by 2022, so engaging with trade unions and women's rights organizations. There remains far more to be done across the sector to improve the lives of women workers and reverse runaway inequality. So practically, our advice to business would be, first, understand what's happening across supply chains, including human rights violations, including what suppliers face, gain a full understanding of the roles that women play in supply chains and the issues they face, and how businesses' purchasing practices add further downward pressure. So that then provides the basis to really tackle those violations. And we know that workers' rights are being hit like never before. So we really need to end the situation now of extreme extraction, as I was saying earlier, by shareholders increasing their income while at the other end of the equation, people are struggling to keep their jobs. And we want more companies backing a living wage. A living wage is really the way in which we can ensure that the minimum rights are being respected.
As you're speaking, Gabriella, I see Leila's nodding her head, so I'm going to go to Leila next. But, you know, as you talk about understanding what's actually happening in your supply chain, understanding what the issues are and how they are impacting the different vulnerable groups, how they're impacting women, how they're impacting migrant workers, as an example, but also tuning in to whether your practices are adding negative pressure or enabling social dialogue and empowering those vulnerable groups. And so, Leila, as I come to you, you know, in this conversation, many, I think, would agree that a redistribution of risks and costs in a post-pandemic global garment industry is absolutely necessary if we're going to address the vulnerability of garment workers, which is where we started our conversation, and not only address their vulnerability, but give them some of that resilience to be able to withstand future shocks. The question that I'd like to close off with you on, Leila, is, how can brands mobilizing social dialogue in particular, including, you know, international framework agreements, which we've spoken about, how can they contribute to shaping a more sustainable, a more inclusive and fair post-pandemic garment industry?
Thank you, Nozi. This work it's not starting now. I mean, I think the pandemic just brings the vulnerability more on the surface, but this is something we have been working more than a decade to see how could we create a systematic approach here. If I just want to be sharp on a couple of things that we see great initiatives or great steps that we have taken, implementing purchasing practices that lead to stable and predictable business based on communication between our business partners has been great enabler for us to secure stability. Our commitments through ACT, an initiative that we founded together with industrial global unions and with other brands, The work has started somewhere around 2013-15, but the commitments finalized on 2017, which we want to ensure that we are just a good business partner and that we reinforce the true cost of labor to our FOB prices to ensure that suppliers can pay their wages. The second thing I can mention here is that bringing our global framework agreement into daily life through our national monitoring communities, NMCs, which has been made by H&M staff, trade union representatives in 6 of our major sourcing markets, operate as case handling bodies, communication channels, provide to access remedy, basically making things achievable, accessible, and also understand what's really going in factories, what's really going on suppliers. And we want to make sure that ensuring worker rights are protected through a decent work and conditions are maintained. The third thing I can mention is activating workplace committees and grievance mechanism in our supplier partners and bring this as one of our pillars in our businesses. To make this together with trade unions and worker representatives to ensure that this is not something that we are continuously talking, but making sure that this is something happening. We are creating access to remedy for any violations and also understand how can we promote the improvements. The last thing I would like to mention is through collaboration with Ilo, trade unions, EIE, brands, all brands, which is in the call to action platform. The pandemic, as I said, revealed many vulnerabilities, but we have seen those signs all the way through last years, especially in social protection system of many markets we also operate in. Social protection remains mainly a responsibility for the national governments. However, we in the brands recognize the importance of us supporting country plans to improve protection, together in collaboration with our social partners, with our business partners, where we are willing to take part as our business responsibility. So what I can say, it is not something that starting now for us, it is something we have foreseen that we need to continuously connect the chain in our social responsibility. It's just becoming even more and more important now in social post-pandemic.
So Leila, I maybe just want to build very quickly on what you said with Atle, because you've really gotten to the nub of what true collaboration should look like. And Atle, we know that, industrial, have signed agreements with over 50 multinationals, and that includes H&M. So maybe just a quick response on how the engagements with multinational enterprises through these global framework agreements have helped to build mutual trust between unions and employers, and to what extent these different forms of cross-border social dialogue can be used to support economic and social recovery in industry. Because I'm hearing Leila talking about nurturing that trust that sits within these relationships. Your comment, please, Atle.
Well, thanks, Nozi. Of course, it's a fact that if there is no contact between employer or brand and the workers producing the goods, the values, then there is no trust. And the workers are experiencing every day difficult situation. And this situation has to be brought to the attention of those who can change the situation. That could normally be the factory owners, but in the case of the ready-made garment sector, it is the brands. Of course, with the owners of the factories that often come from a completely different background, like Korea, like Taiwan. But we have managed, especially through the agreement with H&M, but also with other framework agreements, to create these spaces where we can meet, where our local shop stewards who see the problem with their own eyes every day can meet with representatives of H&M to tell them what is going on in their factory, and where H&M has leverage towards the owner of the factory to make sure that if we come to a situation where they actually see the problem and agree with the problem, they can put pressure on the company to change things. Now, of course, I have to say that the business model of the ready-made garment industry is not the one I would have loved to see, because in most of our companies where we have GFAs, the company themselves own the factories, most of the factories that at least produce the final product. So we had even more leverage then, because leverage depletes the longer further down the supply chain you get. But at least with the agreements we have, also with H&M, we've created these spaces where it's possible to bring to the attention of everybody what's going on and a possibility to solve the problems.
No, thank you very much, Atle. And again, we really are creating the space. The nature of the dialogue is authentic and it's robust, and we're able to bring to the surface some of the tensions. Now, there's an incredible set of questions that have come in, and I'm going to transition to those questions and try my best to bring in the audience voice as much as possible. I'm not going to let up on the opportunity that we have Mr. Guy Ryder still with us. So I'm going to be sneaky and actually put one of those questions to him. And here's a question, Mr. Ryder. And I think it really gets to the essence of the conversation we're having today. The question is, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused major disruption to global supply chains, but also exposed structural vulnerability. What tangible contribution can multi-stakeholder partnerships like the Global Deal make to build more sustainable supply chains where businesses flourish and the rights of workers are respected? I think it really is an all-encompassing question, but it does allow us to create the space to hear your reflections so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nosy. But I think really the answer to that question is in the conversation that I've been listening to from the stakeholders themselves. And I think where you do have this willingness, this predisposition to engage in dialogue, and I think you've heard that from both sides of industry, you have some of the essentials in place. But I think it's asking a bit much if you just leave it to the direct actors to get on with it. I mean, clearly they have to be involved, but they do require what we, I suppose in the jargon we call the enabling environment, to give support and the right type of conditions for success. And what does that mean? Well, firstly, it means governments taking their responsibilities, and we've heard this, to guarantee that fundamental rights are respected. Social dialogue makes absolutely no sense if you don't have representative organizations being able to exercise and make their voice heard freely. So that's one part of it. But I also think there is a global dimension to this recovery process. I think we're in a very tricky position in the recovery right now. And it is vitally important, and it is something the ILO is going to be focusing on a great deal in the coming weeks and months, that we do get a serious international effort to give some sort of meaning to building back better. We hear it all the time, don't we? And I suspect it in some cases sort of generates a bit of cynicism amongst people, because they don't see it getting better. They see it getting a little bit more scary at the moment. And there's one, and I'm going to finish with this, Nosy, there's one thing that we need to understand, I think, when we look at all of our broader ambitions in the recovery process. It's that we need to invest. We have underinvested, be it in training, be it in social protection, be it in digital transition, be it in climate transition. And we have to raise the funds, and we have to direct those funds to the appropriate uses. And that's why the ILO, in accordance with the global call to action for a human-centered recovery that our conference adopted last June, we're moving towards, two things which I hope will bring together this conversation. One is we want to convene or help to convene national tripartite dialogues on recovery processes in all of our member states. So that's where our stakeholders come in immediately. And then we're looking to try to put together what we're calling a multilateral policy forum in the early months of next year, where not just the ILO, but the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and it won't have escaped your attention that they're meeting right now, maybe the OECD, maybe the World Trade Organization, come together, because we need to find ways to act internationally to direct resources to where they are needed. And I've already pointed to the dangers of this great divergence which is out there. I'm still waiting to see what the growth figures the IMF come out with today for this year and next. But it seems to me we've got to operate at all these levels. The people on screen right now, those who are closest to the ground, national governments to provide the right conditions, and then we need this international solidarity as well. And my last word is, if you get a chance to read the UN Secretary General's report on our common agenda, where he uses the expression of a global deal he means a slightly different global deal from this one, and a new social contract, I think you find all of these elements. And what better call could we have to join all our efforts together than that? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryder. The call to action is loud and clear. Just yesterday, Minister Holberg in the opening statement spoke exactly of these national tripartite dialogues. Of course, as you're speaking about a multilateral policy forum, I think we'll all have our eyes on those IMF numbers now, DG, especially after the conversation, because they are a direct invitation for us to engage with the reality that is unfolding, whether we enable a continued divergence or whether we fund and behave differently. Paula, I want to bring a quick question to you that's come from our audience as well. And this is a question around migrant workers. The question is, how could social dialogue be used to support migrant labor who may not have any form of legal rights or are excluded from national social protection? And this question comes from the Ethical Trading Initiative. Paula, any thoughts from you?
Yes, just briefly, of course, migrant workers are one of key priority for the trade union movement. And of course, in terms of advancing the rights and putting upfront the rights at the center of the migration agenda, of course. And also when it comes to the organizing agenda of the trade unions. And this is why, of course, I would like to reiterate the efforts the trade unions are doing worthwhile to actually protect the rights of those migrant workers, both and also transnationally, so from the country of origin to the country of destination, and therefore trying to build up safety bridges, in order to protect the rights of workers, in the trajectory of that they are actually undertaking. So, of course, for us, the organizing agenda of migrant workers and welcoming them in the trade unions and finding for them the trade unions as their family is one of our priorities.
Thank you so much, Paula. So really important to hear that migrant workers are on the agenda. They haven't fallen off the agenda. And maybe, Minister Nxesi, I'd like to bring this next question to you, because I think it's a question that has high relevance for the South African context. So if I might invite you to pop your camera back on as I land this question. The question is from an independent consultant, and the question is, what is the role of social dialogue in the distribution of productivity enhancements, considering a context where there's high unemployment, including because of automation? So how do we ensure, what is the role of social dialogue in advancing productivity in a context where there's high unemployment? To you, Minister Nxesi.
I think in this particular area where there's mass unemployment and the issue of productivity and also the issue of technology, it's very clear that we have to anchor this on what I would call training and skilling in terms of the modern technology. You know that if you have technology, you can be able to produce more. But the concerns have always been, what about those workers who are going to be replaced by the technology? Because I think a lot of employers, they want to produce in mass. And if you introduce that particular technology, we are going to have the workers who are laid off. That's why our emphasis and part of the fund which we are using, the labor activation program, is to focus on those workers who are getting retrenched, to retrain them and refocus them into the other areas. And I want to also implore or emphasize that unions need to understand that when we're talking about productivity, it's a term which they should embrace. We must not just talk about rights only, we must also talk about rights and responsibilities. But the key is, how do we enhance the workers to be able to face these challenges. Like I've said before, for maximum impact, there will be a need for the social partners to promote this cooperation and mobilization together. And let's put all the issues in the agenda on the table. And there must be no holy cows, and discuss them and try and find solutions. Thank you.
There should be no holy cows. Every single issue should be put on the agenda for discussion and debate and engagement. Now, we're a couple of minutes away from the end of the conversation, and I'm going to attempt to close off this conversation in a memorable way, in a way that we'll all remember. So I'm going to put everybody on the spot, and this is because the team that has been working on this Global Deal Forum has to come up. I can see Minister Nxesi's got a worried look on his face. Minister, it's okay. They have to come up with a report that captures the essence of the outcome of the conversation every single day over the next 4 days. Now, we've got to help the team by giving them a title for the report that's going to capture the essence of the conversation today. And I'm going to help you a little bit. And I'm going to say, think of a phrase that starts with social dialogue can, and you then would complete the sentence. Now, I do want to just remind and thank, Professor Ocampo is gone, but had he been on, I would have said to him, just a reminder, this is just a report. So think of an A4 size report. It cannot be a summary. It's not the executive summary. It is not the first chapter. It is just the title of the report that really captures the essence of what has come out of this conversation. And it starts with social dialogue can. Now, what I like to do is always look at the faces that look the most worried and go there. So let me go to Atle first. Atle, you're not looking worried. In fact, you're looking pretty confident. So let me give you the first shot of it. Social dialogue can. How do you complete the sentence?
Social dialogue can change the world of work.
Thank you very much. It's short and sweet. It's a lovely title. Social dialogue can change the world of work. So Atle, if you are on the leaderboard right now, you're right on top and you're the man to beat. So let's see how everybody else does. I want to go to the Vice Minister. Vice Minister, I'd love to hear your voice. Social dialogue can. What is your title of the report?
Social dialogue can give voice to those underrepresented. And then let me tell you a little bit about it, because in our tripartite conversations, we have employers and workers, and they are mainly formal workers, and of course the government. And it is a responsibility for the government to give voice to all those workers who are not represented, especially, and of course, the informal ones.
Vice Minister, it's an excellent title. Social dialogue can give those who are underrepresented. So we got the title and we got the executive summary from the Vice Minister. Very quick one, but it's an excellent one. So Gabriela, you're looking very relaxed, looking very ready to do one better. Let's hear from you. Social dialogue can.
Social dialogue can be one of the most powerful equalizers.
Sure, can
Too
be
short.
one of the most important equalizers.
Powerful. It's all about redistributing power also. So it's a powerful equalizer when companies and employees engage in this dialogue, and it can redistribute power across supply chains. That's the longer phrase, but
so it certainly is. It's certainly a very powerful title. Social dialogue can be one of the most powerful equalizers. I know the team is leaning in, just as I'm taking it down. They certainly are also taking all of these down to play with today. So let me see where I haven't gone on the screen. Paula, let me come to you next. Let me come to you. Social dialogue can.
Okay, let me try. Social dialogue can deliver national job plans for a human-centered recovery and resilience.
Okay, I'm going to get that. Social dialogue can deliver national job plans for
a human-centered recovery,
a human-centered recovery
and resilience.
So we've got it all coming in, including the global call to action baked into that title. So Leila, let me come to you next. Leila, social dialogue can.
social dialogue can reduce vulnerabilities, increase equality, and build resilience.
Reduce vulnerability, increase equality, and build
resilience.
It's succinct, it's to the point, it's catchy, it has rhythm to it. I think it might just be the one, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I let the Director General off the hook. He is still with us, and I certainly think that he should be given a shot at this. So let me come to you, DG Ryder. Social dialogue can.
Okay, I'll try, but don't forget the minister, please, because it's not fair otherwise. I'm going to come at a different angle. We're running out of options. Mine is social dialogue cannot work without you.
Can we get the executive summary? Cannot work without youth. We haven't heard spoken about young people very much in this conversation. So a quick executive summary, just some back end there, Director General.
Well, in a conversation which has mentioned the excluded, informal workers, young people, women, I think we ought to be putting the emphasis on inclusivity, not only in the results of social dialogue, but in the act of social dialogue. And, and I think, and we've heard some of our colleagues speaking about the need to reach out and get to those who don't always take part in these processes. So it's a sort of a call to inclusivity.
Thank you very much, Director General. So it's not just about the results of social dialogue. Are we paying attention to the act of social dialogue and being truly inclusive? Minister Nxesi, I'm coming to you last because I started with you in the conversation and I wanted to give you a lot of time to really knock it out of the ballpark. So here's your opportunity. Social dialogue can.
Social dialogue can promote economic recovery for the benefit of all. And by all, then I'm talking about that inclusivity and that balance. The employers, the employees or unions and government, and the youth and the women whom we always regard as always excluded. To me, therefore, if we do serious social dialogue and go beyond, of course, go beyond the three traditional partners and start looking at the role of the community organizations and NGOs.
Minister, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as we wrap up this conversation, allow me to say social dialogue can change the world of work. Social dialogue can give voice to those who are underrepresented. Social dialogue can be one of the most powerful equalizers. Social dialogue can deliver on national jobs plans for a human-centered recovery and resilience. Social dialogue can reduce vulnerability, it can increase equality, and it can build resilience. Social dialogue cannot work without youth, and social dialogue will promote an economic recovery that benefits all. I do not think that I could have closed it off on a better soundbite other than what we've heard from our panelists. It's a massive thank you to all of you. And a massive thank you to all of you who have logged in from around the world. We really have enjoyed your inputs, your questions, your comments, and we certainly invite you to continue journeying with us over the next 2 days. One of the other themes that came out quite strongly today was the theme of due diligence. That is the focus of our session tomorrow at 1400 hours. So we're really lifting as we go along and threading through so that these conversations hang together in a way that allows them to be comprehensive. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a 30-minute break, and I'm going to invite you at 1600 hours to reconvene for one of our partner sessions that is starting then. And this is going to be based on international contributions from the Global Deal France platform, so you certainly don't want to miss that. And then tomorrow, we are connecting at 1400 hours for session 3, but at 10 a.m., we're going to start off with the partner session led by the International Trade Center, and that's going to be looking at decent work and social dialogue and how it might look like to emerge stronger from the COVID-19 crisis. It's going to be a really amazing session, and I hope you don't miss it. Remember our hashtags, hashtag Global Deal Forum, #social dialogue. Let's amplify this conversation. From myself here in Johannesburg, South Africa, it's goodbye for now, and hope to see you at 4, and of course again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you so much for joining us.